Good morning and welcome to Frank's School. 111th day of the 6th year, first video. And I'm going on with this Hydra in my head idea. This is going to be the elder. Before circled around or centered on J.J. Camp, that I regarded that as the eldest. I'm sort of trying to come in chronological order. And remember, I'm trying to sort out all this tangle of nouns and terms and ideas. Largely for myself in a way. I got some comments which surprised me, and people actually looking at this, and I continue to have this sort of dread that I will get involved in memoirs or autobiography or something like that. I really don't. I think if I get the feeling that I'm doing that, I'll stop because I really don't want to do that. I'm looking for sources of what are those influences that have made me think so differently? Although one man suggested that I didn't think differently at all, I have to wonder and act differently. How well he knows me. Anyway, some corrections. I remember my mother insisting that Grandpa Jim or her or whatever, I said they were Victorian in their attitude. And she said, no, Edwardian. If you're going to look at it like that, then Edwardian. You know, Victoria was such a towering figure. She kind of covers that whole century. She says, no, Edwardian, and she made the distinction. I remember that. That guy, Fritz Haber, he also invented poison gas, which is, he's kind of better known for that, but explosives and especially fertilizer are really the tremendous influences, I think. Princeton was the other. I was trying to think of what was the other Ivy League school I was accepted at. And I wanted to go to Princeton because it was closer to here. It was in New Jersey, and the campus was pretty. It wasn't in the city. But I deferred to my parents' wishes. I remember my mom saying, anybody who's accepted at Harvard goes to Harvard. Well, so said she. Anyway, now I'm sort of centering on her, but here's my mother, here's my father. I put her in the center because she was more influential, I would suggest. Because they had 5 kids. My dad was a traveling salesman. He sold chemicals to dry cleaning plants. He'd sometimes call himself a soap peddler. My mom basically raised 5 kids at home. And for other reasons too, along with the help of her dad in a way, she was the bigger influence, I think. So let me deal with her. Well, together, they of course experienced the Great Depression. My dad was born in 1912. My mom in 1918, so they would have been very much aware of what was going on during the Great Depression and of course World War II. My dad served in the Navy in the South Pacific in World War II. I'm not, in Mein Kampf, Hitler and all that. I mean, I'm not going to hit on the influences that just profoundly influenced everybody so much. All right, let's go on now with my mother. Her favorite book, she had once said, was Islandia. It's not a very well-known book. I got a copy, I read it, I gave her a copy. Eventually it came back to me. It's utopian. I found that interesting. It might say something about her. By contrast, my dad's favorite book, he often said, was Swiss Family Robinson. I'll talk about him in a minute. All right, well, books like or writers and artists like Eric Sloane, Edwin Tunis, Dorothy Hartley, the way they drew things, and I don't know if they exactly glorified the past, they just documented the past of that other time when things were more primitive, in a sense. She exposed me to them. American Barns and Covered Bridges, I think, was the first one of those that I had seen. And then later on, Shire albums coming out of England. Quite late in life, she and my dad traveled to Sweden and to England a little bit. And I still have them, and they influenced me a lot. I added to the collection. All right, now another thing about her was botany. In a way, she almost stumbled into botany, I think, when she was in college. She had a course in landscape architecture and loved it. And Rodale's organic gardening, Rodale Press, she was very influenced by that. Botanical gardens. Once I got into college, I dabbled in botany, more than dabbled. I mean, I almost made it my career, botany. And so there was that profound influence. And I've gone to botanical gardens all over the world. Whenever I've traveled, and I knew that there was a botanical garden to go to, I tended to go to it. The thing about her, though, is she was no worker. She was a student. She loved to read these books, but seemed to have almost no understanding of how much work and how hard the work is so often. It was just in her mind almost, and so she was no worker, and I guess that would detract from her, but she was a student. Silent Spring. Now that came out in the '60s. That was quite late. I tend to think people get most influenced by the world they live in up to about their 20s, and then they tend to get locked into that kind of thinking, and they represent that particular time. But in her case, I would say maybe not. She kept developing quite long. So certainly Silent Spring was greatly influenced her. She was no worker. She was certainly a student. And, she loved to go to auctions and the primitivism of antiques. I can remember when she was getting very old and it was obvious she wasn't going to be around that long. I said, what am I supposed to do with all this stuff that you've got, all these old things? And she said, a museum, maybe? And I've talked about that elsewhere. And when all the various things were divided up among the children, I made it a point that I would keep the primitive stuff that had to do with farms and stuff like that. Nobody else really wanted them or had any place to put them. She introduced me to open-air museums. Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts was probably the first, and I continued to do that. And even, she was no musician. That was on my dad's side. But I remember folk songs. Oats, peas, beans, and barley grow. Oats, peas, beans, and barley grow. Da, da, da. I can almost remember her singing that to me. And, a folk song about farmers. There was that gentleman farming. She came by it honest. In a sense, that's what she was. Now, my dad, very different. He was a chemist. His dad was a mill worker, Oscar. He was a glass blower, northern Pennsylvania. Both of them were from Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, in my origins, I'm extremely Pennsylvanian, even though they moved away to New England, and that's where I was kind of raised, but I was very much Pennsylvanian and continue to be so. A mill worker's son, Swedish immigrants. My dad actually spoke Swedish fluently, and he was completely Swedish. And you can imagine immigrants at that time, mill workers, that probably tells you a lot about the way they were. Hardworking, Lutheran, Republican. I think they probably both were Republican. Eventually that changed. Very moral and very musical. Very musical. When I try to look at why I do what I do, well, music, what I ended up doing with a local choir, taking it all the way to performances of Bach's B minor Mass and all the major choral works, for what? Just for this little local community? Yeah, I couldn't help it. The music was in me. It was almost a major as well, music major, but he was very musical. And moral, he was a salesman. He was charming. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I remember a conversation I once had with him when I was very young, and he was explaining what he did, or I asked him. And he said, well, he was a salesman. And I questioned, well, why would you have a salesman? Well, a salesman tries to convince somebody to buy things. Why don't they just buy them? And he was trying to explain the whole, I was questioning the morality at a very early age of advertising, convincing somebody to buy something. That's what a salesman does. And I remember him saying, well, his product, they were going to buy some product anyway, and this one he sold was the best. And I think I remember saying, what if it wasn't the best? Would you still try to sell it to him? And I don't remember exactly where the conversation goes, but it has to do with what I how I later acted and continue to act in a way. Well, both Mom and my dad were teachers. As a matter of fact, I've thought sometimes that our family is a dynasty of teachers, almost like Bach and the musicians. I think every one of my sisters, except for one, married a teacher, and they all were teachers. Mom and dad were teachers. I mean, it sort of on and on it went. So they were teachers, and they were devoted to children. Their children, but children in general. I hesitate to tell you this in a way, but when my mother died, it was in May. It was right by the end of the school year. And I went to school that day. They couldn't find a substitute. There was no substitute for my students. And it was like the day after she had died. And I went to school because I had no substitute. And I remember some teacher said, "What are you doing here? I'll cover your classes," or whatever. I mean, they were going to come up with a way to deal with it. And, and that's what happened. Then I left and I went, on to deal with it. But I thought, well, that's probably what my mother would have wanted, because children were just that important, and you couldn't leave them out there hanging. Well, whatever. That's a heck of a note to end on. But in any case, there we go. Two extremely influential people. I'm trying to figure out where the sources are, and now I think I'll come more to me myself next time.